Thank you, everyone, for joining this American Banker webinar on advancing consumer privacy in the era of digital finance. I am John Pitts, the Global Head of Policy at Plaid, and I am joined today by a wonderful group of panelists to talk about privacy, consumer data rights, and all things digital finance. Just a little bit of background about me before we get in. To everyone else's introductions. I am, as I said, the global head of policy at Plaid. And before that, I was at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I joined Plaid about 4 years ago to build the policy function. Plaid actually is one of the first fintechs to build out a policy function. And we did that because we viewed sort of consumer data rights and consumer data control and portability as a core consumer financial right moving into the next decade, and wanted to drive that. And I wanted to be at a place where I was aligned with that vision and could drive it. But I am the least interesting person here. I am just moderating three much more interesting and intelligent people. And I will ask them to each briefly introduce themselves. Sheila, why don't we start with you?
Thanks, John. I'm Sheila Jambakar. I'm the Chief Privacy Officer here at Plaid, and I've been at Plaid for about, I guess, 16 months or so now. It's done my career in privacy has been focused in the technology companies, and was really excited about coming to a company where digital finance and building privacy into the fabric. No pun intended, building privacy into the fabric of this digital finance ecosystem that is burgeoning. And so it's a little about me.
Thank you, Sheila. And Zoe, how about we go to you next?
Thank you, John. I'm Zoe Strickland. I'm a senior fellow at the Future of Privacy Forum. Quick background, I've been a privacy weenie wonk for over 25 years. I've been the Global Chief Privacy Officer across industry sectors, including retail, Walmart, United Healthcare, and Cigna, and a stint as the Global CPO for JP Morgan. With Future Privacy Forum, that's a leading global privacy think tank. It brings together over 200 companies and 45 academics and 20 civil society members. And the goal is to really convene participants on very complicated issues to think through what will be a possible path forward from a privacy and technology standpoint. And I lead the open banking work group for FPF, which I'm grateful to have both Sheila and Christine, the next speaker, a member of, as well as some other leading companies.
And Christine, that's the perfect pass to you.
Great, thank you. So I'm Christine Fry, and I'm the Global Chief Privacy Officer at Bank of America. Zoe may have me beat. I'm about 23 years in privacy, but I've been leading and developing privacy programs for over 20 years of my career, primarily in financial services, but also in the direct marketing space early on when there were no laws, rules, and regs, and it was a little bit of the Wild West. But I currently here at Bank of America for the last 10 years have been the privacy officer, and I really help set the standards and the policies around privacy here at the company. And I also lead our compliance and operational risk program as it relates to data privacy. And I'm very excited to be here. This is a very topical topic.
Thanks, Christine. Really quickly, just a little bit about Plaid. So Plaid is an open finance company. We're the technical infrastructure that allows consumers to safely and securely connect their financial information to the services they choose, and to manage their money across a lot of financial institutions, apps, and services, and lead overall healthier financial lives. To date, hundreds of millions of consumers have used Plaid to connect their accounts. And in order to serve those consumers, we build connections into more than 12,000 financial institutions worldwide, helping to power more than 7,000 financial apps and services, from the smallest startup to the largest banks and retailers. And in fact, just in the last quarter, 2 of the largest brands in financial services signed on as our customers. So given that everyone from the smallest fintech to the largest banks is choosing Plaid to make it safe and easy for their customers to access financial data, we see privacy as sort of a key driver of what the next generation of financial services is going to have to be built on top of, which is why we're happy to be in this webinar today. I want to, before I ask the first questions to the panelists, just set us up a little bit on the privacy side by talking about why all of this matters to consumers. And over the course of this webinar, I think we're going to talk quite a lot about how much collaboration is required. And in order to understand why we're all incentivized to collaborate, I think talking about the consumer and starting there is really important. So consumers have been our North Star at Plaid since day one. And given our position in the ecosystem, we feel a responsibility for enabling consumers to have the type of control that they want to have over where their information is shared and how it's shared. And what that means to advance consumer privacy in this age of digital finance is to sort of put these consumers and their expectations first. So we did a nationally representative survey a little bit earlier this year, actually last year, since we're now in January. And some of the results that popped out, I think, are pretty striking. So 76% of consumers say that they have more trust in financial companies when they clearly provide their privacy practices and make them available to the consumer. Consumer Reports actually released a report today reconfirming that and reconfirming how important those privacy practices and their transparency are to consumers. The other thing that jumped out to us was that 83% of Americans prefer to control where their financial data is shared rather than having companies make those choices for them. So just to set that up, right, what that gives us is we want to know how companies are going to treat us from a privacy perspective, but ultimately we, the consumer, want to be the decision maker, and we want to be that decision maker while interacting with lots of different companies at the same time. And I think, given that background of the increased desire of consumers both to be able to share their data and have control over it, we're at a really critical juncture right now. And the reason for that juncture, at least in my mind, is we've got Congress pushing forward with privacy regulation or privacy legislation. A number of states have recently updated their privacy laws. And we have the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau moving forward with a critically important rulemaking on consumer data access, which is known as Dodd-Frank Section 1033, that's going to establish a consumer's right to share their financial data wherever they want to share it. And to me, that suggests that we are in this world where financial data is going to be increasingly portable, and companies are going to need to increasingly coordinate with each other to protect the consumers and give them the controls and tools they want to go along with that portability. So this is an important moment, and getting it right now matters for everything in the future of digital financial services. Hopefully that's a clean enough setup for my panelists to sort of build on with their expertise and give us a good first Tuesday of Data Privacy Week by digging into some of these issues. So with that, let me go to Sheila, I think, with the first question and ask Sheila, how do you think big picture about these critical questions on consumer privacy and financial data privacy in your role at Plaid? What's the North Star for you in thinking about what a consumer wants and deserves when it comes to their privacy?
Oh, thank you for the question. First off, you pointed out in your question, putting the consumer front and center. If we think about what data privacy is really about, it's about the right to be in control of your data. That's a core tenet of privacy. And I think there's an increasing recognition amongst regulators, legislators, states, that privacy is not just about the security piece of it, protecting, but it's also respecting people's data and building trust and giving them control over their data. So here we are in a company that is sort of an infrastructure company that helps the digital financial ecosystem in terms of helping consumers, enabling them to be able to move their data. And so how I think of it is going back to that first principle of what are we trying to do and solve for with data privacy, which is putting that consumer in control. And of course, that means that there's certainly a lot that Plaid does within its own walls in terms of making sure we're being a good data steward, that we're being transparent and improving what we can do. But we also see that that doesn't, from a consumer's perspective, that doesn't solve the entire picture. And so we want to think outside the box of our four walls and think about the broader ecosystem. What can we do in our position, in this sort of intermediary position that we have, to enable our customers, to enable our data provider partners, to promote and improve privacy across the ecosystem. So that's kind of how I see my role. There's obviously the traditional, got to make sure we have our own house in order and we're doing the right thing. But I also want to think beyond that and help the company think beyond that. What can we do to enable trust in this ecosystem? The reality is, because it is an ecosystem, we're all kind of in it together. And so trust in the ecosystem benefits us all. And also similarly, if there's a lack of trust, that impacts us all in a negative way. So I think of it as kind of bigger than that, and going back to those first principles of what can we do both internally, but also beyond our walls to help build trust and encourage consumers to feel that they know what's happening, they're in control, and also make sure that they feel like this is an ecosystem that they can trust.
So that trust idea, Sheila, I think is the right thing to narrow in on here, because ultimately, I think trust is as much, maybe more about consumer expectations than it is about anything else. And those consumer expectations are going to change constantly as the world around the consumer changes. So Zoe, let me take this question to you and say, in our increasingly digital world, how are consumers' demands and expectations of that trust shifting when it comes to safety and control and privacy with their data? I'm particularly interested, sort of given your experience at JPMC, in what stands out to you as what works in financial services when you think about that desire for control in information and how it should be channeled and how to do it responsibly.
Yeah, thanks, John. I'll talk a little bit about safety and then a little bit about control and just sort of say, well, how are we thinking about that? In safety, we often think about the risks are constantly evolving, and responsible companies are always trying to minimize threats and prevent disruption and bad actors and poor uses and security of data. And in permission-based sharing, and it's pretty well articulated in the CFPB proposal that you referenced, there's a couple ways it could be done. And one is that the consumer gives their login credentials to a third party who then pulls that information out of a bank's website or their login, and they call that screen scraping. Another method is through software that the parties all work together where the credentials aren't shared. APIs are a really developed model now. And as you can think about it, screen scraping in some ways has a lot of convenience to it, but from a security perspective, you're giving your logins to a third party. And there's a lot of other compliance challenges with that, but we've been trying to educate consumers for a while to keep those credentials to themselves. Don't let a third party act as you. And so the industry and I think policymakers are moving to a more secure way of enabling these permission-based sharings. And I think that's smart, honestly. We really want that data to be secure. From the control perspective, agree with Sheila 100%. A lot of times focused, and rightfully so, on the security side of things. There's a whole separate activity around privacy and control, which is, let's say security is perfect, which we know it never is, but what is okay and not okay to do with the data? And if you look back, over time, 25 years ago when the FTC was first started really playing in privacy, the control related to the examples they used were marketing and sharing with third parties. And that was kind of it, on-off switches. Today, in the last few years, there's been a real evolution towards what they call individual rights. You see that in regulations throughout the world, including the United States. which includes things like right to be forgotten and also more consumer control and direction. And digital environment really supports that. But besides the enabling technology, there's more of a goal around self-reliance and some of the stats that you pointed to. In the FI space, again, some of the older laws related to data sharing for the company's benefit. So you can stop a bank from sharing with their business partner, unaffiliated parties. But it was really more, do I agree or disagree with what the bank wants to do for their business plans? And now there's really well, the consumer wants something for their own plans. And what does that look like? And I do think the financial sector, banks and the fintechs and the aggregators and Plaid are really thinking through both from a regulatory perspective, but also from a consumer perspective. How do we meet that? What does that look like? And so you've seen a lot of evolution in services to be offered by all the parties, cooperation between the parties. And what does that look like? How is that done in a privacy and security centric sort of way? Again, digital supports it all, and it also enables interoperability and global data movement. Just right quickly at FPF, on our work group on open banking, we are doing a deep dive into these policy issues and thinking pretty deeply about some of the recommendations for policymakers on some of these core activities, including the security and control aspects of permission-based data sharing.
Zoe, one of the things that jumped out at me as you were talking is just how often you said regulation in that answer. And I think, in other countries, privacy regulation is something that broadly applies. I think one of the areas where financial services is interesting and distinct in the United States is in the absence of a GDPR, a lot of companies don't deal with sort of regulation every day as defining their business. But Christine, if I can direct this question to you, I think a lot of banks and even non-bank financial services company, like, regulation defines big aspects of your business, and it does that not just in privacy but everywhere, and that can make a real difference in terms of how you execute. I'm wondering, sort of, as Zoe mentioned, with a lot of the privacy laws changing or being considered for change, can you share your perspective on sort of what shifts are happening in the industry today from a regulated entity's perspective on privacy, and how does that sort of change or affect the way that you approach consumer privacy, and how does it change how you manage legal and compliance in a very rapidly evolving space?
Yeah, it's a great question. And while I've been in privacy over 20 years, really 10 in sort of a core financial services. And I think one of the differences, as we've alluded to, is that banks and financial institutions are governed, especially in the U.S., under these sector-specific laws, rules, and regulations around financial data. So many of the programs are built around compliance with those laws, rules, and regs. And then what operational risk, right, is sort of created as a result of complying with those regs. And I think increasingly over the last 10 years, that's definitely sort of at the heart of a lot of what we are looking at. Are we complying with the laws? I mean, we are heavily regulated. We are supervised. The banking regulators are in every day down the hall, so we can attest to that. Really inspecting and making sure that companies are complying. But the dialogue doesn't stop there. And I think that's what's really important, that even in banks where sometimes it's viewed as it's just compliance oriented, it isn't, right? Because we're just as interested in consumer trust and the customer experience and, looking at it from all facets. And the way in which we've, kind of managed and what I see shaping the future of the privacy program is we're just as interested in looking at the innovations, especially that are coming through digital innovation, and whether we're talking about, open banking, digital banking, artificial intelligence, whatever these emerging technologies are, the laws were not necessarily written to govern those types of practices. And so we tend to not just be law, rule, reg focused, but very principle focused as well. Like, not just what can we do, but what's the right thing to do? I mean, there's an enormous amount of dialogue here that plays into that because, careful what you wish for. You don't want too prescriptive of laws, rules, and regulations, right? But on the other hand, there's not a handbook that we can all turn to, which is why we're having these conversations, right? I think, industry is well prepared, and I think, the bank and all of us on this call to really help drive best practices and industry self-regulation in many ways with definitely regulatory parameters and guidelines that create a fair and level playing field across the ecosystem with clearly defined roles and responsibilities. But internally, I would say that, we're not just looking at compliance. We're definitely looking at all of these different things and taking very much a principle-based approaches with the customer top of mind.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing to me there, Christine, is that idea of this not just being a compliance need, that this needs to be broader than that. And I think the principles approach that you lay out and Bank of America's way of handling it really is exemplary. Sheila, if I can turn to you, I'm curious if you can react a little bit to what Christine just said about that. It's not just compliance. Like, if it's not just compliance and the rules are changing and you need to be able to see ahead and sort of do the right thing for the consumer without that handbook, how do you operationalize that? How do you spread that beyond just a compliance team to the rest of the company?
No, that's a great question. I echo, I was cheering on the inside when I heard Christine saying that it goes beyond just the compliance piece and really looking at the principled approach, because to her point, this is it's not just an evolving set of regulations we're being faced with, but it's also an evolving set of tools and innovation, and the laws and the handbooks, to the extent they even exist, aren't going to keep up with it. So you have to kind of go back to those principles of what is privacy about? The upside of privacy, even as much as it is changing and there are new laws coming into effect, they all are founded on some very similar core principles called the Fair Information Practice Principles. And so you can kind of use those as touchstones as you think about a principled approach, which also then helps you think ahead and get ahead of where legislation or regulation may be going by sort of going back to what are the principles of privacy. You're going to get a lot of bang for your buck by focusing on those sorts of well-established best practices rather than sort of chasing the new law that might come up from, at this point, it feels like every 3 months where there's a new law that's coming out. And so that principled approach, I really loved what Christine was saying. And in terms of, how do you then operationalize this? I think that going back to those principles is key. Thinking about what those best practices is key. And then you have to really go outside of your legal and compliance team, because at the end of the day, the data that we're talking about is kept in engineered systems in the digital space. There are engineered databases, systems, APIs. These are all things that impact the day-to-day handling of the data. So I don't like to think of like myself or my team as the owners of privacy. We're more like Sherpas for the company. We are here to guide the company and to help the company understand. But when it comes down to execution, everybody who's touching that personal data, it sounds very cliche, but it's so true. Everybody who's touching the personal data has to have a role to play. And so it's my job to help make sure everybody sort of understands what their role is and how they can help. But it makes it fun, but challenging, because you really have to work across all of the business units that are touching this data. You have to really understand your technology and work with your engineers, or have people on your team who can really understand and dig in with the engineers to help them to translate between these sort of lofty legal principles or these legislations, this regulation, and say, okay, this is what this means in practice when you have to actually engineer a system that does those things. So that's kind of the approach that I like. It's the part that's challenging about this role, because there's often like not a perfect fit between what the regulation or the principles want and how that actually can get executed in practice. But it's also it's an opportunity for innovation. That's where you can really like stretch yourself, and also working with the technology teams and the other business teams of really thinking about, okay, let's take that principled approach. What does this look like as applied to this specific system, as applied to our business? What is the right thing, focusing back onto those principles?
So the complexity of managing that, of sort of inserting that privacy by design into every aspect of a company, especially when you've got different technical systems that are doing different things, sounds complex to begin with. when you then layer something on it like Dodd-Frank 1033, right, and a statement by the government that, hey, consumers have the right to share their data wherever they want, including outside of your system into somebody else's system, it feels like the complexity there gets a lot steeper really quickly. And so this is a question that I want to hit all of you with. I'll start with you, Sheila, if that's all right. The CFPB is doing a rule saying consumers have the right to share their data, and also there should be privacy protections and controls that go along with that right. I'm spending a lot of time on this. I think it's a really critical piece of federal regulation, and we're, as Plaid, a big supporter of that. But I wonder, Sheila, if you could tell me, like, what are you hoping for as a privacy professional out of that regulation? Like, what would you like to see in December of 2024 that would make you like wake up with a big smile on your face saying, yeah, they got this right?
Yeah, so I think that the thing that I see in what the CFPB is doing, and I appreciate, is really putting the consumer experience front and center. And I think that, to me, is what I would love to see. I'd love to continue to see is that consumer experience, regardless of who in this sort of networked ecosystem is in charge of the data, that consumer experience is put front and center, so that it creates a requirement and a necessity of the players having to work together and create some consistency. And what I mean by that is consumers don't know what law applies. They probably don't even know who the CFPB is, who's the cop on the beat. What they do know is they expect their data to be protected and respected. They want to feel like they can trust the companies that they are sharing their data with. And part of what helps them feel in control and helps them understand and experience that transparency is if there is some consistency, and that the parties have worked together to try to create a consistent experience as much as possible. So as much as what would make me happy would be if the rules come out with some encouragement and some guidance to create that consistent experience for the consumer that, again, puts them front and center and in control of their data. And I think, one thing that I can tell that the CFPB is thinking very hard about is that dynamic between trying to take a very complicated system and still putting them in the driver's seat. So I kind of think of the analogy, if you get put in the driver's seat but you can't see, then you don't have the transparency to really be in control of that car. So that doesn't count, right? So transparency is key part of control. But also, if you get put into a driver's seat and there's so many confusing knobs and switches and too much information coming at you, that's also not a great experience, and you don't feel like you're in control of that experience. And so that tricky balance between making sure you give consumers the knobs and the switches that they need, but not overwhelming them, that's going to be a really interesting challenge, and I think something that industry can play an important role in based on our experience of actually trying to do that in practice. And so I'd love to see that as well baked into what they do, is that understanding of that balance and really looking to industry to help guide from our experience of like what works and what doesn't.
Well, I know we know CFPB is the cop on the beat and have actually suggested that they oversee Plaid and other aggregators, which we would welcome as part of this rule to make sure that the system works right for consumers. And Christine, I know you also know the CFPB is the cop on the beat. So from your perspective, what are you hoping to see from the CFPB in terms of privacy protections as they move forward with this 1033 rule?
Yeah, I completely support everything Sheila said, but the additional dimension I would throw in here is, you think about web cookie banners and you think about, privacy notices, and all of a sudden the consumer, what control has equaled historically, it's all put into their hands and they have to figure out the knobs and the whatever other descriptors that you use, Sheila, right? And I think that we have to drive accountability as well, because while consumers want the ability and we support their ability to port their data from one company to another company, and we could completely support the competitive landscape. I think consumers still need companies to be accountable to manage that for them to some degree. Because again, I think success equals supporting the innovation, but it has to be conducted responsibly. We need to ensure the consumer's data is protected. We need to make sure that the mechanism under which we share that information to support their control and their request is in place, and that there really is, there needs to be more clearly defined roles and responsibilities between data providers and data receivers. I think we're calling them our recipients, whichever the right R word is. But I think that has to go along with this, because absent that, we put it all in the consumer's hands, and then I don't know that we land where we want to be. We need to be thinking about accountability frameworks that are the responsibility of the parties in the ecosystem to help support that consumer choice and control.
Zoe, and that was great, Christine. That idea of having those clear responsibilities and making sure that the consumer is protected, even as they are handed from company to company, I think has got to be core to this. But it also sounds really complicated to figure out. And Zoe, you mentioned earlier at the top that you're leading the open banking working group. This is open banking, really, that we're talking about, or open finance. And I know Plaid and Bank of America are both participating. From your perspective, sort of what are you all doing to help solve that complexity, separate from what the CFPB is doing? And what would you like to see as an outcome here that you think would make you say, this is a good rule, this is going to work?
Yeah, John, I love this question. I think each of us are like, yes, let's think through what could really be effective here. And first off, I got to give a lot of credit to the CFPB for making a lot of progress in a very, very complicated area, which they had to do under Dodd-Frank. And I think doing it through this proposal first, I think they're going to get a lot of comments, which will help inform their rulemaking later in the year, and hopefully make that a better process, including their consultation with small businesses. Two areas, and we've got several, but two areas I just want to flag in terms of how we've been thinking about our recommendations, which touch on what Sheila and Christine have been talking about. One is a little bit more clarity. We're now talking about, John, to your point, sharing data between companies is not just an internal activity. So you've got to operationalize it. So principles are great, but you still have to get to the rubber in the road. So when you say you've got to have disclosures and permissions, okay, for what? Is it the parties? Is it the data? Is it retention? Is it access? What exactly is it that needs to be part of that dialogue and that permission, or what's the best practice? And then, who's the one collecting it and what does that look like? And there's been a lot of conversation amongst very cooperative industry players on that score. And second, to really underscore what Christine said about risk models and roles, that's just critical to this, and I think is where policymakers can really help. Trying to say that aggregators or recipients are service providers, which is an existing model, or vendors, doesn't really work because they have independent permissions from consumers. So they have independent relationships, independent uses of data. In some ways, they're a controller as well, to use that, a privacy term. So they got to think through that. But the good news is risk modeling is very familiar in the financial sector. It's how the sector functions. So as an example, you've got an industry group called FDX, which has been working on technical standards for APIs and a certification program. Well, one thing the CFPB could do is say, right, data providers, you can't control everything that the recipients and aggregators do because they, are collecting that data, but what kind of oversight makes sense? Do you have these certifications? Do you have decent security practices? Are you meeting these sort of technical regs? And that provides a sort of oversight that allows the banks and providers to think through it, the aggregators and recipients to play in the same pond, so to speak, and for the regulator to have an oversight over all the activities. And I think, you always think about, well, geez, when policymakers get involved, it could either be helpful or it could create some hurdles. I'm going to focus on the positive. I mean, if you look at what it could look like a few years from now, often the case when they look at frameworks, what are the right principles? How do we prioritize responsible data practices and cooperation among industry? How do we leverage the good work that's being done with an oversight model, then I think that can really help advance the ball and make responsible data practices flow through, and again, provide the timelines for it to just flow through, the large, medium, small, and all the different components of the ecosystem.
I want to extend on something you said there, Zoe, about collaboration, not just within your working group that you're leading, but collaboration broadly in the ecosystem. And Christine, direct this question to you. I think a lot of early privacy frameworks were really based around sort of an island approach, right? Every company has their own privacy responsibilities. They do it for their customers. And once you leave the shoreline of that island, it's not your responsibility anymore. I think what Zoe was laying out there was a much more network model of privacy where there has to be collaboration and cooperation as the consumer moves across multiple different parties in that network and their data moves across multiple different parties. From your perspective, running one of the privacy at one of the largest financial institutions in the country, how do you think industry can best work together to establish those best practices and controls in this new network model? Though you don't have to agree. If you think it's not a network model, tell me I'm wrong. But if it is more of that network approach, how do we go about building that and building that muscle of collaboration and cooperation on privacy?
That's a great question, and it all depends what you mean by network, right? So I think that there still has to be defined roles and responsibilities, right? But I couldn't agree more that if we try to solve for this in silos or sector-specific, role-specific, that we will never get to the place that we all want to get to, which we talked about, which is success, which is empowering the consumers to have control over their data, to have consistency and transparency, but also a level of certainty that their data is still protected. So I think there's nobody better than the players in the ecosystem to really help work that Future Privacy Forum is doing, work that FDX is doing, groups like Akoya, which are providing sort of there's small players, there's large players. So we may be large and be able to, innovate and implement some of the best practices, but we need to make sure that the ecosystem, also from a competitive perspective, right, can help ensure that the ecosystem is working as intended. And so I think collaboration is critical. And I think, the collaboration has been taking place. I think there's more opportunity for that. But I really think that, we've shown some success already when the groups come together, to really help, to provide either central utilities or whatever this is going to look like, right? I don't know that we know yet what it will look like. I do think having some guidelines from a regulatory perspective will help support that as well. I think part of the problem at the moment is parties aren't clear how the regulators are going to view their role or their liability in this whole network, if you will. And so I think part of that, supplementing the guidance that we hope or that we will see out of the CFPB and potentially other areas, I think that collaboration is critical. The market participants have to come together to make sure that we have built the best in class and a market, sort of a sustainable and a resilient, if you will, network, I'll use that term, right, lowercase n, to really enable innovation, right? Because it's going to change, right? What it looks like today isn't what it's going to look like probably in 12 months. And so we want to be able to, again, the concept is to support the ability for the consumer to have a right and to have control of reporting their data their financial data from one, entity to another. But that's going to evolve over time. So I think the best practices and setting up, I think, infrastructure and technology supported infrastructure to help facilitate the secure transmission, I think is really important. And the companies have to come together and the ecosystem has to come together to really set those parameters.
What it's going to look like today is not what it's going to look like in 12 months. I think that that may be the key phrase of all of this. And I think the difficulty there is that that's not how regulation works, of course, right? Like once you write the regulation, you've got it written down. And so that makes this a pretty high stakes moment to get it right. And also gives me an opportunity to go from one of the audience submitted questions. And again, a reminder for everyone, if you have a question for the panel, please submit it. This question, I think, Zoe, I'll steer this one to you. What has happened in other markets that we can learn from as we sort of hit this critical regulatory moment in financial data privacy? I know, we've got PSD2, we've got open banking in a lot of countries. Are there any big takeaways that you think we all should be looking at as we look at other countries as exemplars?
Yeah, there's been a lot of activity in the space globally, and you've mentioned some of the big hotspots. Obviously, the UK and Australia, some Asian countries, Brazil is doing a lot of activities here. So I think for folks who are primarily US based, should be aware that there's a lot of activity happening in lots of places, and that we need to pay attention to that because you don't want to be last at the table. And I think a lot has been going on from the industry perspective, which has been being able to support all these different activities, which is never easy in the global space because the laws are always different. And I do think that the underlying goals are similar. The idea around consumer control being at the heart of this, and are there ways to foster competition amongst the different players? FEF actually did a paper and a joint conference with the OECD last year, and we found, and it's on our website, that there were three general approaches. One was prescriptive, where the regulators really dictated a lot and sort of top down kind of told folks what to do. And that's either because of their dynamic and maybe because they were early players. And there were some friction with that because since they don't have the direct consumer relationship, some of it worked better than others. Another model is more market driven, is supporting that. And then there's a hybrid model. And I think with the prescriptive idea that there was a lot of desire to promote this activity, but there were the downsides in terms of lack of flexibility and consumer drop-offs and things that had to be reworked and continue to be reworked. So I think generally speaking, policymakers should be thoughtful about, where, do they want to step into technical standards or not, and how do they encourage the behavior they're looking for through a framework, principle-based approach. And I will say, when you look at what other countries can do, one real difference with the U.S., besides the sectoral approach that Christine mentioned, where in the U.S. it's sector-specific, many countries have very broad-based rules. But in this particular area, they have very focused rules as well. Some countries do have national identifiers that the government issues, which helps them in the authentication space. That's not as viable a path in the United States, but there has been a lot of work done around authentication identities, particularly in the financial sector. So I think more good work to leverage from that. And the industry should continue to look at authorizations, standards through FDX and other bodies. Again, the cooperation we've all talked about here, the user experience, and what makes that a better process. Again, besides the regulatory mandates, what does that look like and how do we continually improve to meet their needs? And all these things can kind of work in tandem. And I think you're right, John, and the other speakers here, this is an evolution. And if we look back how far it's been and where it's going, and how it might support open data more broadly, besides the financial sector, I think are all things being looked at.
Thanks, Zoe. And for the record, I'm only right to the extent that I agree with the three of you because I know who the experts are here. So another question from the audience. Christine, I think this one's an interesting one for you, so I'm going to send it your way. And Sheila, I might ask for you to answer it as well, because I want to see if you have the same answer. Because the question is, there's no definition for portability. And given that lack of definition, what are the best practices you would recommend to meet that requirement when it's not yet defined? So Christine, let me start with you on how do you deal with portability when it's not defined? And then Sheila, I want to hear your answer too.
That's a great question, tricky question too. I mean, outside of the U.S., it is defined in some cases, right? So it's not a brand new concept in the world of privacy from that perspective. But I think portability, as I think about it, especially in the privacy context, is what we've been discussing, right? Is the ability for the consumer to control and transport or have their information shared between entities so that they can, take advantage of a particular app, that aggregates maybe financial data across different financial institutions is just one example, right? And so portability, I think, is the notion of a consumer being in control and having the ability for certain information. I think that we have to be careful how broadly data can be ported. I think there's dumb data that the principle of data minimization, right? So, which is a different definition. But, as we think about portability, I think at its core, it's about the consumer being empowered and having the ability to transport their data in a secure way from one entity for another for them to really, benefit from different financial products or services.
Is this my turn to react, John?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's just a bummer. I keep agreeing with Christine. I think that was a really great definition of it. She's right. We're seeing it in Europe. Portability is already a concept that was baked in under GDPR, their General Data Protection Regulation. So that's now, I guess, oh my gosh, we're going on over 4 years. And you're seeing it also under California, is recognizing that right of portability. And I think, to add on to what Christine is saying, it really goes back to that idea of control. I think, historically, when we think about consumer rights, it's sort of the right to prevent things from happening to their data, to say, I want to delete my data, or I just want to know what data you have about me, or want to object to you using my data in a certain way, or opt out of a use of data. And portability is sort of a recognition of a more sort of proactive, positive, active right on the part of the consumer to move their data. And that is, both parts are important for control, both the ability to restrict a use of and limit a use of data, but also a right to proactively make use of one's data. And what I'm encouraged by is that, given that so much of our lives are digital these days, and so much of ourselves and to live our lives needs to be done through this digital space, it also gives more empowerment to a consumer in their life when they have that sort of positive control over their data, not just simply the ability to prevent something from happening. So that would, I would say, sort of like it's the flip side. If you think about control holistically, it is that flip side of not just I get to make you stop doing something with my data, but I can actually say I want you to do something with my data and make sure I'm truly the one who's in control of my digital self.
So I think we have time for maybe one or two last questions. I'm going to try and blend together two questions that have come in on the chat. If you want to be the last question asked, now's your time to submit. So go ahead and submit. And so this question is, what resources are available to companies that are trying to navigate this space that you all would recommend? Or what tips would you say a company that wants to do this right should follow to build this internal capacity? Zoe, I'm going to start with you, and it's totally fair game for you to say that FPF is a resource that everyone should consider as they do this. Go ahead.
I have to say, since, and again, we love the Q&A section because there's always great questions that come in. I would say that, I mean, FPF is a good resource here. Feel free to reach out to us. There's been a lot of good books written about open banking. So if you're deep into this, there are some good books as well on this space. I recommend people looking at we've mentioned FDX a couple times, each of the speakers, looking at that in terms of industry standards. And getting engaged, to be honest, with your privacy people and your privacy lawyers. If you're in the financial space, this particular rulemaking, I think is getting some of the most attention I've seen in this space for a long time. The comments are due tomorrow, so we will see what comes in. But I think the more people get engaged, and a little bit actually to a point made earlier today about embedding privacy in your culture. One thing I've been very grateful to see over the course of, many years is for a while, many years ago, privacy and security were something that the experts did within a company. Please take care of that. Make sure we don't have problems. And now the level of knowledge that I see through GR folks and product people and business people and leadership is it's a different ball game. And even an example in our work group, we've got product people, and that's kind of new for privacy. So both internally and externally, I think there's some good resources here, and there's definitely more to come.
+1 to
now that you've told
FPF
me
being a great resource. Sorry, just wanted to say +1 to FPF.
was going to ask you and Christine the same question. What tips and tricks or resources would you steer audience members to? Go ahead, Sheila.
Sorry, I didn't mean to step on your toes. I was just going to say, I really do, echo Zoe. FPF is a great resource, and they have a lot of helpful resources that help simplify some of the concepts and privacy in general. There are, though, also the organizations like the International Association of Privacy Professionals, which have a lot of information that help get kind of the foundations of privacy under your feet. I'm sure many a law firm will be happy to share their expertise as well. But I agree with what Zoe's saying. You probably have some of those resources right under within your own organization with your privacy team, and getting to understand what they know and get embedded with them and have them get embedded with you is a great way to kind of get that feel for what's coming.
And Christine, I'll give you the last word for any suggestions, resources, tips, or tricks that you have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you guys have gotten some great resources, tips, and tricks. When I first started trying to get my arms around open banking, what all this was, and the privacy implications, I literally just did some searching on the internet. There's a plethora of information in addition to all the great resources like Future Privacy Forum, the IAPP, the FDX, the ones that have been named. I think just sort of reading up on reliable sources, I think there's a lot of information out there and a lot of interest from different points of view as well, perspectives of the different parties in the ecosystem. In terms of tips and tricks, and I know that as Bank of America, we have the resources to be able to build out some of these things that are already in the proposals for 1033. So we have been, from a best practice perspective, really, building out infrastructure to support the secure transmission of the data, no screen scraping, moving towards APIs, right? We've been actually already implementing into our mobile experiences the ability for somebody to confirm that they want us to share certain information with a data aggregator, as well as to come back and revoke that consent, so that we really are, taking an accountable role in helping as this is evolving, building some of that out. I would say, how transparent are you in your practices? I think one of the best practices you could look at is, depending on where you are in this ecosystem, how transparent are you being, and are you really looking at just the basic privacy principles, like kind of going back to that principle-based approach, right? Are you only sharing the data that you really need to share in order to facilitate the product or the service, right? Are your notices clear? Is it somebody that's easily understandable, right? Have you differentiated between, a primary use and a secondary use? I think really foundationally going back to some of those privacy principles that are common across, regardless of what we're looking at from a privacy perspective, those principles sort of hold true. I mean, I would recommend sort of foundationally building upon those as you implement your products and services.
And I'm glad you mentioned FDX again, Christine, because I do think if I had to give one suggestion for any company looking to get good here, the Financial Data Exchange is one of the places I would start. The thing I like the most about it is Financial Data Exchange is a bunch of people in the industry getting together to come up with agreed upon API for data access, including the security protocols that go along with it. And what's amazing is you can be the smallest company and join FDX, and you will know that your API is up to the same standards as the largest financial institutions in this country. And that to me is, for small players, an incredibly powerful lever to know that with confidence you're doing this right and you're doing it the same way everyone else is. So I just can't recommend that enough as a resource and an opportunity for people. Full disclosure, Plaid and Bank of America are both in FDX together, but you can check it out for yourself. You don't need to take our word for it. Unfortunately, it looks like that's about all the time we have for today. Thank you everyone so much for participating in this webinar. To sum it up, I think what we've heard today is that now is the time to be thinking about data privacy, especially for consumer financial data. We're at this important moment where regulation and legislation are both shifting, but even faster than that shift is the shift in consumer expectations. And we all have an obligation to meet those expectations. That means we need to prioritize privacy for the long term because it's going to be with everyone's business for the foreseeable future. So now is the time to build trust with your stakeholders and with consumers. Now is the time to figure out how to work together across the industry to develop best practices and to coordinate so that we can always put consumers first and deliver on the privacy expectations that they have. Thank you very much, Sheila, Zoe, Christine, for joining us today. Incredibly lively and informative discussion. Really excited to continue this dialogue as the rulemaking continues and as we continue to build out the top of class privacy experiences that consumers really want out of financial services. That concludes today's webinar, and thank you again to everyone for participating.